Welcome everyone to this first in a two-part series on innovative partnerships shaping resilience, urban planning and investments. My name is Nancy McPherson, recently semi-retired from the Rockefeller Foundation and strategic advisor to the Resilience Community of Practice. Today we have panelists from South Africa, Ghana, Switzerland and New York, and we're looking at how slum dweller generated data can influence inclusive urban resilience planning and investments. And thank you all for joining from all over. We've got people from all over the globe, and thanks to our brilliant Zilient team for getting us all on here and hopefully keeping us all connected for the duration. When we looked at the questions that you sent in advance, one of the participants, and thank you for this question, you really nailed the essence of our discussions today by asking, can you tell us how slum dweller data has sustainably changed policy discourse and influenced investments? So just to say in advance, we may not have the perfect answers for you yet, but this is exactly the essence of the potential and the promise of what we'll talk about today. And this work is being funded under open innovation grants, which really are to push the frontiers on work in resilience measurement, and how we can use these kinds of approaches to influence and scale work that's going to impact the lives of millions. We have 5 wonderful panelists who are all working on the open innovation grants, and they are, in order of speaking, Skye Dobson, who's the Director of Learning, Monitoring and Evaluation with Slum Dwellers International, Al Hassan Baba Husseini, National Director, National Data Coordinator with the Ghana Federation of the Urban Poor, Katarina Schneider-Ruth, who's the CEO of Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation, Nsé Nsima, who's the Program Manager with 100 Resilient Cities, and Ndodeni Dango, who's the Regional Coordinator with Informal Settlement Network. And I'm sorry, I think Ndodeni is going to speak before Husseini. So participants, thank you again for the great questions that you sent in advance. The panelists are going to start to address some of your questions as they speak. So please send in more in the chat function of the webinar. So we've tried with 5 very experienced and capable panelists, we've tried, and a wealth of experience that we could talk about. We're going to try and make this as conversational as we can. So here's what we've planned for the next 70 minutes. Skye will give us a brief 5-minute overview of Slum Dweller International's, SDI's community data collection work called Know Your City. And Ndodeni will answer a few of your questions, and Husseini, at what this work looks like on the ground. And I must say we are really, really pleased to have both of them, because it's not often that on webinars you actually hear from people that really are right on the ground doing this work. So we're very grateful to them for joining. Then we'll hear from Katarina Schneider-Ruth from GIB on the potential of SureScan to be a real game changer in influencing infrastructure investments, with Durban as the first example. Nsé Nsima from 100 Resilient Cities will tell us about the work they're doing with SDI and Itad to mainstream Know Your City within resilience planning and implementation processes. And we'll hear from SDI Federation members again on what this actually looks like on the ground. Then we'll continue with your questions. We'll pick them up as they come in. So please send us your thoughts as we're talking. Okay, so let's jump in. Skye, please tell us about SDI and the Know Your City campaign that we can see very brilliantly in the background with you there.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much, Nancy, and also thank you to Zilient. I like Nancy's term, brilliant Zilient. That's a new catchphrase for so I think a lot of people are aware of what SDI is, but I'll just give a quick brief before running into what Know Your City is. So Slum Dwellers International, SDI, is a global network of slum dweller federations striving to create more inclusive and resilient cities where the lives of the urban poor are substantively improved. To achieve this vision, SDI network can be seen to work along 3 critical pathways to making change at the slum settlement level, at the city level, and at the global level. They're working to change the status quo of how development is done. SDI's strategies cut across each level from the settlement to the global, feeding advocacy at the global level, trying to make sure that the global agenda speaks to the local priorities of the slum dweller federations that manage this network. Since its inception, profiling, community-led profiling, enumeration, and mapping has been one of the core strategies for achieving change from the settlement city to global level. And this work is now dubbed Know Your City. It's part of a global Know Your City campaign, which we see as a groundbreaking campaign to generate invaluable local knowledge, to anchor partnerships between informal settlement communities and local governments, and to produce action and implement the global development commitments that we have made. So this Know Your City, how this links to resilience and resilience knowledge and practice. We're seeing now that in debates around resilience, the issues of informality and inequality are coming up very strongly, but yet there's not really sufficient data to address this in the resilience planning of cities. This is where we think that SDI can make a real value contribution. And also we have to understand how the implementation of global resilience, climate and poverty commitments demand that we have a different relationship with the 1 billion people now living in informal settlements. These communities, if seen as partners in the process and contributors to the knowledge that informs resilience planning and implementation, can help to catalyze a new era of resilience development in the urban space. So I think with these innovative partnerships that are being showcased today, tried to show is that this data is not just valuable at the local level in the development of sort of interventions at the local level, but can feed into the global strategies that determine how resilience planning and investments are made based on data and partnerships between governments, development players, and urban poor communities.
That's great, Sky, thanks. And several participants asked the very good question of how SDI federations involve women in data collection. And I know that that's a big part of the core rituals of SDI. Could Interdeni tell us a bit about how that happens?
I think Fuseni was going to address this question, but I'm not sure if he's on the webinar. Is he on?
All right, do we have Fuseni? Have we lost Ghana?
If not, Interdeni can go ahead and answer that question of how women are involved in the Know Your City profiling and enumeration work and in the federation more broadly.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Nancy. I think women in federation, they know how to collect data and how to make the data. It's an information of our power. To get our power, we must have the data collection. So that's why we call it our slogan, that information is power. So I think women are mostly involving themselves to do the savings and do the profiling so that they know how their way of living.
Yeah, yeah, no thanks. And I remember being so struck when I got to know what you were doing at how much. Oh, we have Husseini. Husseini is with us. Please add Husseini if you would like.
Okay. Yeah, I want to talk about the KYC data. Yeah. I want to talk about the KYC data, the effects of the policies formulations within the Ghana. The KYC data was influenced the Ministry of Local Government to establish a national urban forum framework that consider so many formulations from the KYC data, information from the KYC data. It also includes the example like housing policy within Ghana, where the slum upgrading policy, a magnitude of slums in Gama project in Accra. The other issues that relate to the data issues is to then look at the national level, includes vulnerable communities, flooding, and services, because the KYC data speaks to issues informal settlement.
No, thanks.
Yeah, and then talking to about how the women influence, how the women be part of the collecting data within Ghana is that looking at deepening the community, mostly the community is about how to collect data to acknowledge, to deepen knowledge within the community level, and to locations, boundaries, and limitations, and drawing their own maps. And looking at Ghana Federation, the women is about 95% of women who are part and parcel of federation activities within the settlement level. And currently, our federation leadership is a woman. The president of the Ghana Federation of Durban is a woman, Janet Edo. And we have a lot of influential women within the federation aspect. And looking at our data, how we were able to come out with some of the capital issues in terms of capital projects, but collecting data also make the community members to give a space within the community level, available space within the community level, and own the land, and to be able to sustain the projects will be coming into the community level, so that it won't be like when you do a project in the community level, people will not take care of the projects within the community level. And looking at the women itself, the women are the most important people within the community level, because when you are going to galvanize the people within the community level, the women was the first step of bringing them together in order to make their own decisions, because the women are always been suffering within the community level. And in terms of the resilience, there's resilience issues. The local economies, we need to dialogue. We are dialoguing with the women in terms of the potential banners, networks, to involve the women in partnership and decision making within the city level participation, so that they can be coming out to bring out the issues within the community level for the planning as a city level, in order to come out with the issues that they have identified within the community level. So apart from all,
thanks.
Yes?
Let's hold it there, and you can come back, and because we're going to talk about partnerships and the influence on cities a bit more later on. But thank you. And I think anyone who, and if you don't know SDI, for the participants online, get to know them. The role of women in this organization is really phenomenal. And I think sometimes we worry about reaching men, but the women in this organization play an amazing role. Okay, now let's hear from Katrina. And Katrina, tell us about GIB and why you think the Standard for Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure, otherwise known as Sure Smart Scan, very good name, holds great promise for influencing planning and investments.
Thanks, Nancy. I don't know if the slides are coming up now. I'll just start talking anyway. So maybe first about GIB. We are a foundation, non-profit foundation in Switzerland, and our main aim is to mainstream sustainability and resilience in infrastructure design and finance. In particular, we just want to make resilience and sustainability the norm in infrastructure, not the exception. And as according to estimates of the OECD and the World Economic Forum, infrastructure in emerging and developing countries accounts for the vast majority of the required finance to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a basic for a lot of things. As you said, Nancy, the SURE standard, it's called SURE, the Standard for Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure. It's a non-legally binding, voluntary, independent standard, and it's third-party certified. As we developed it, we collaborated with a lot of stakeholders in different sectors, both industrial and emerging countries. Stakeholders were involved to develop a set of criteria, environmental, social, and governance criteria. It's 61 of them. And they were defined and agreed upon together. The standard is under ISEAL, which is an umbrella organization of standards. And as you can see on this funny bubble slide, we've tried to integrate most of the frameworks, the Sustainable Development Goals, different standards that are already out there, like the Sendai framework for disaster and risk reduction, or the ILO fundamental principles, the City Resilience framework. So we, as Kai already said, we try to bring the global discussion onto a project level. So translate global agendas onto an infrastructure project level. And once a project is certified, it also automatically complies with these frameworks. Next slide, please. Here you can see these 61 criteria, the 3-dimension, the 14 themes. We measure the performance of infrastructure projects according to these criteria. And the good thing is this result makes projects comparable. So projects certified by the SURE standard guarantee compliance with minimum environmental, social, and governance criteria. And projects may also go beyond these minimum requirements and actively contribute to the solution of major sustainability and resilience projects. Thus, our standards also highlights benefits arising from sustainability and resilience efforts. And I want to stress it again, it's based normally, as it was developed, it was based on infrastructure projects. So that's roads and water, sanitation, waste, transport, and other sectors. So one of our, in our cooperation with SDI, we are trying to translate these criteria to another. So we are using also another simplified tool, this SURE Smart Scan, Nancy already mentioned, because the SURE standard is a very complex system. It takes months to get a real certification. But with the Smart Scan, it's a short version of the whole standard, and an assessment you can do within a day if you have all the information. We can come up with results very fast, and we use the Smart Scan for this cooperation. So we can say, for example, with this slide here, we can show a bit the outcomes of our cooperation. So you can see a Smart Scan assessment here of one of our selected informal settlements in Durban. And this is where we can see what the innovative potential of this collaboration is, we think at least. For the first time, we can measure resilience performance with an infrastructure background, I would say. And one of our aims when we developed the standard was also to identify risks, because identifying risks translates a bit to an investor's language. And you can see here that there's a red line and a green line, and the data in between is good performance. And then if it's over the green benchmark, it's excellent performance, and under the red one, it shows some weak points. And we try to bring the Know Your City data to answer questions of the Smart Scan. So we had to translate these questions to fit the circumstances, and it was a very fruitful discussion we had with SDI, and we learned a lot. I hope this also will lead to very good results. And what we hope is that, or in the next step of our project, we hope that we can identify areas for improvement, and our final goal is to link the identified measures we would take out of these suggestions for improvement, and link them maybe with potential business cases, or at least we might be able to have some, or make some statements about one slum and its opportunities. And when I looked into our work today again, so the most interesting part really is because we looked at we analyzed 2 slums, and that there is a way to compare slums. It might be another systematic way to see where the strengths and weaknesses of several slums are, and then if we can compare these data at the end, we could draw some interesting conclusions, I think.
Great, thank you. And I remember when we got to know Katrina and this work, and for those of you that work in the infrastructure financing world, I mean, you know the trillions of dollars that are tied up in financing infrastructure. So this is clearly groundbreaking work. And one of the things Katrina told us initially is that roughly 70% of the SDGs are dependent on good, resilient, sustainable infrastructure. And that's quite stunning when you think of that. And it's true, water, housing, sanitation, all of it, you know, and it's so hugely relevant. I think this is enormously groundbreaking work. And if you can de-risk financing, that would be a major scale. So let's turn now to ENSE and 100 Resilient Cities, another brave initiative on the frontiers of influencing what cities look like. ENSE, tell us about 100 RC and what you're doing to integrate informal settlements into planning and implementation of resilient strategies.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Just a really quick couple of sentences on what 100 RC is, given the very diverse audience. So 4 years ago, the Rockefeller Foundation committed $164 million to create 100 RC to mark their 100th anniversary. At 100 RC, we're focused on helping 100 cities around the world in every continent build resilience to the social, physical, and economic challenges of the 21st century. So as a key part of that process, we work with cities to develop and implement resilience strategies. And so that's really important because that's a lot of, it's particularly within that process that we're trying to integrate this Know Your City data. The resilience strategies are designed to help this implementing city, their private sector, civic and government partners, and citizens understand and address the city's shocks and stresses in a comprehensive way. So while our major partner is the municipal government, we do take a really broad and extensive stakeholder engagement lens towards the work. So the process helps cities accomplish three things. One is identification of their unique resilience profile, determination of key resilience priorities, so actually concrete initiatives that the city is committing to undertaking, and then implementation of those priorities. So, you know, as a lot of this audience I'm sure already knows, at 100RC we believe that an increase in the occurrence of shocks, so catastrophic one-time events, and the deepening severity of stresses, underlying chronic challenges, has made more urgent the importance of building the capacity of cities and their constituent parts to withstand and thrive under these conditions. So in our experience, resilient cities have 7 qualities. So they're inclusive, flexible, redundant, robust, resourceful, and reflective. And so to be effective in pursuing these qualities, African cities in particular, I work with a number of African cities, and the KYC collaborative project is focused on 2 of our African cities, Accra and Cape Town. Right now, African cities and others in the global south can't ignore the informal sector, both because we believe that it constitutes such a significant portion of the city, right? And because there are inherent strengths within the sector that can be leveraged in the resilience building process. So we know that, you know, right, there's still in some places a debate around informality and it being viewed as a problem or a sign of a lack of development, something to be solved for by certain stakeholders. But we also realize that for those who live and survive through informality, these systems create an opportunity for social, economic, and political possibilities when the formal system is inadequate, right? And so like that alone is reason enough for us to be considering it in our resilience strategies. And then moreover, informal systems are able to adapt and transform over time in dynamic contexts. And that's really what resilience is fundamentally about. So we are, through this collaboration with SDI and Itad, and through the Know Your City process, through the integration of that data, we are looking over the course of the partnership in Accra and Cape Town to try to integrate Know Your City data. So just in a really like concrete way, the SDI federations in Accra and Cape Town are developing slum data summaries for their respective city governments, for their chief resilience officers and the resilience offices, as well as specific recommendations that emerge from that data, right? So if you consider what the statistics say about informal settlements or the manifestation of the informal economy within those settlements in Accra, what are concrete recommendations that the People's Dialogue or the Ghana Federation of the Urban Poor might recommend to their Accra Metropolitan Assembly, right? So we're working to try to actually get at those core recommendations. And we're hoping that through this pilot project, just in 2 cities, we'll be able to elevate lessons for cities and other stakeholders around the world interested in integrating data on informal settlements into the planning process. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how we're hoping that spreads.
Great, thank you. And I was struck listening to SDI and then also 100RC at the World Urban Forum, just the reports, 42 years since Habitat 1, and slums are increasing. So the problem is not solved yet, and the resilience strategies, so really critical that the 100RC resilience strategies are translated into real action on the ground. And thank you for that, and say. And Dodani, tell us then, what's it actually take to, from the ground, resilience from the ground up, what's it actually take to connect then with the resilience strategies that are being developed?
Yes, thank you very much, Nancy. I think I can appreciate this. I'm the one that I'm representing the men's, and in the informal settlement network, we are 80% of men. As you know that it's made between
Oh, good.
men.
Sorry.
So now we are men in the informal settlement network, and one of our main shocks that are facing in the informal settlements is a fire. So because of the material that we build our shacks, so it's easily to catch up the fire. So I can give you the example of the settlement that I'm living in, that's in Guamatambo informal settlement, where we are trying to mobilize and profile and enumerate the people, and the people started to focus on the resilient because they saw that they can do things for themselves, and the women started to go inside and opening the savings to make the settlement to be organized. So at Wamatambo, we started to did the reblocking exercise because our settlement were very, very density and we were having a problem of fire. So we started to do the reblocking, and the municipality at that time wasn't recognizing us because we were having no tools to use as a settlements dwellers on that time. But before we did the reblocking, and municipality started to came inside and having a space to bring the services on our settlements. They brought electricity, as we were living 20 years without electricity in our settlement. We were using illegal connection and candles that were affecting many people's lives. There were many people who were dying all the time. So after our reblocking, there were ablution facilities that were municipality sent to our settlement and extended of the standpipes and a drainage system. But all those things, drainage system, the community was doing the layout for themselves, because what we were learning from SDI is to do things for ourselves. That was a bottom-up approach, and the municipality, when they come with something, we must tell them we want this ablution on that side of the road, not on the other side of the road, because it's safe and it's gonna be safe for women and the children. So that's why we are saying our data collection was a power tools to use it as the informal settlement networks. And the officials of the municipality were starting to negotiate with us and coming to our settlement to come and ask how many people are living here. And we are telling exactly a number, how many people are living in the councillor. And the councillor knows what is going on in the settlement, even the neighbors where we were living. Before, we were like dogs and the cats when we're going to the neighbors. Now, when we're going out, neighbors, they're recognizing us. They know that we are the human beings who are staying in the informal settlements.
Great example. Thank you. Thank you so much. And clearly one that any initiative like 100RC and the other resilience and climate change city initiatives, clearly this is a powerful partnership to, to implement those kinds of strategies. Sky, one participant asked, what counts as policy relevant knowledge for slum improvement? We can see on the wall behind you, you've got a whole structure of knowledge and indicators and to collect this kind of information. What do you think translates into the policy relevant knowledge?
Thank you, Nancy. I think as Durvani's example highlighted, one, there's the basics. How many people are here? What are the existing services that are available? What's the land situation? What is the tenure arrangement? the basic information quite often just simply doesn't exist. I remember when I was working in Kampala, the city hired a consulting company from Europe to come and develop a informal settlement sanitation master plan. And as the consultants were driving to City Hall and looking at the census data that they had been given, they realized we're driving past informal settlements that don't even exist on this map. So how on earth can we produce a plan given data that is 8 years old and doesn't represent all the information? So the city told them, go and see the Federation. They're the ones who have the most up-to-date data. So the basics obviously need to be there. But then I think the resilience framework offers a sort of much more nuanced understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve with our development. It brings in the economic, it brings in the political, the social, the environmental dimensions, so that we stop these sort of single sector interventions that are very output focused and don't actually improve equity and sort of the development outcomes that we seek.
Yeah.
The third key point is exactly what also Ndodeni was talking about. The data alone isn't what's making the change. It's this community was organized and was able to engage the city and plan amongst themselves to turn this data into an actionable strategy. So the granularity of the data, the sort of the localized data that's settlement specific becomes incredibly important for translating our policy intentions into action. So I think those are the key points.
Yeah, that's great. And voice to what matters. You know, so many of these decisions and so many of the strategies in cities and urban planning, you know, are determined by other people. So being able to actually have a voice in what matters to measure in terms of making those decisions. I see a question from participants that I just want to ask now, and then we'll come to you, Katrina. How receptive have city governments been to either incorporate SDI's data collection methods within their existing data management systems, or to scale them to the city level? So Sky or Ndodeni or Fuseni, would you like to respond to that? Or is it early days?
No, it's not early days. It's early days in terms of the resilience strategies, but it's not early days in terms of the other city level policies that this data has been used to inform. So Fuseni, maybe you can talk about the specific policies in Ghana and then the city strategies in Accra that your data and your partnership has informed.
Yeah, in terms of Ghana, especially Accra, our data that we have collected and we use it with the municipality, that is the Metropolitan Assembly within Accra, in order to change some of the perceptions and policies within the informal sector. Looking at the data that we have collected, some of an example like Old Fadama community. Old Fadama community was a squatter settlement, and people doesn't know how many people living in the community. But because of the federation, we're able to collect data, our own data, and we're able to disseminate the data and use the data to engage with the city authority. And finally, the city authority, because the community was a time bomb, because they wanted to evict the community. But after we collected this particular data, they now listen to us and they are engaging the community leadership in order to find solutions in terms of the data, in terms of the issues within the community level. And looking at our partnership with the Asamo, it has been very good in terms of how we can come together and look at the issues within the informal settlement that we have as our federation. Because we realize that in the city level, some of the data that they have is not accurate data that they have, but the community level that we have collected our own data, that will let the city authority understand that we live in that community and we have able to collect our own data, and we can even collect the data at any time that we want to collect. But the city doesn't do that, and that make us dialogue with the city authority within the information that we have, and it is working well for us as Ghana, because because the data that we are using, we even ask them to include the community participation in terms of decision making within the ensemble, so that the people themselves can make their own decisions within the ensemble, so that they can feature it into the planning in order to find solutions into the community level.
That's great, thank you. And so clearly it's happening, and SDI has been reaching out and with NSA's example also in 100 resilient cities. I guess the big question now is how one actually gets it to scale. And so I want to come to Katrina around some questions that have come in around how do you get the smart scan feeding into decision making at the policy and investment level? Because one thing is to, as NSA has said, get the strategies right, get SDI federations and informal settlements involved, but then one needs to influence a big effort on investment and private sector involvement. And private sector is not all that involved in some of this work. Katrina, can you talk about these aspects?
Mm-hmm. So where we start out is that we know that resilience in slums is insufficient. And but I think the question is, we don't know exactly which aspects are the most urgent ones and how capital should be allocated in the most efficient way. And the KYC data is a fantastic process to do that, to collect that data. And we're trying, by the means of the SURE Smart Scan, we think we can provide an interpretation of these data, maybe a new interpretation of these data, and highlight the most important issues. Because in that way, I think it's also important just to make them visible. That would be the first step, to make the most important issues visible, and then formulate investment needs. And hopefully out of that, we can develop business cases. And as I said before already, the interesting insights we had so far is or what we think we gained so far is that we can see that the needs of different slums might be different. I think we can help with the prioritization there, or defining those needs, prioritizing them, and maybe even come up with a bit of a market analysis in a specific area. And that's what we're trying to do. Great.
And so let's turn to NSA. And so NSA, you've Heard Husseini and Dodeni talking about what's happening in their communities. How do you ensure that planners continuously engage slum dwellers in urban planning? One thing is to be invited to a meeting. The other thing is to be seen as a long-term continuous partner.
Yeah, so I think sort of in the spirit of how you even begun this webinar, we're figuring it out as we go along, right? So I think it's important to sort of foreground that with that acknowledgement. But I think a couple of ways we're trying to do that with this SDI 100 RC Itad collaboration is to, like think beyond the resilience strategy development process, right? So one, thinking towards implementation. So not just how is this data being considered in the like analysis of the city context and in the making sense of what's happening in Accra, what's happening in Cape Town, but then how does that actually inform concrete initiatives that make it into the strategy, which are something that the city government is committing to trying to implement, right? So that's one way. And then another way, sort of moving beyond the resilience strategy development process, to also think about other planning processes that are essentially like legislated mandated requirements for the city, right? So when we talk about bringing the SDI federations and the Know Your City data to the table with the Resilience Office, we're also bringing to that table whoever the key owners are of the mandated city planning process. So in Accra, the director of planning, whose responsibility it is to develop the medium-term development plan, is also sitting at that table, learning about the Know Your City data to be able to think with a longer view, right, about how that might be integrated into that legislatively mandated document, right? And so thinking beyond, you know, about multiple processes, not just the resilience strategy process, is definitely one way. And then also trying in as much as we can to ensure that this isn't just a like person-to-person connection, right? So we've heard lots of stories of how different SDI federations, you know, key people within federations have been able to establish relationships with key people within government. And while that's great, and we know, you know, relationships are key to this work, we're also really paying attention to how do we institutionalize this, right? And whether that's in tandem with thinking about how we're institutionalizing resilience and the resilience office as well, but trying to ensure that it's not just you know, this one government official and this one federation member who have like a particularly good relationship, because when things shift, then what does that do to this longer term process that we're trying to ensure will happen?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, I think you hit right on it. It's how do you institutionalize it? First of all, how do you integrate it so it's not a one-off thing? And then how do you institutionalize it? And Dudeni, do you have any words of advice of how this happens at a community level? How do you get integrated into the process and stay in the process?
Yes, thank you, Nancy. We are having our slogan as SDI, that information is power. So we are collecting data to build a strong communities. And those communities can do things for themselves to go and do their own profiling and enumeration and do the layouts of their own projects. And we are teaching those communities to be organized and to be the strong communities and to generate their own data. So to negotiate with the municipalities in the process of maybe to build their own houses, to do their own sheds, and to do partnerships with the municipality, and started to do things for themselves. So I think it's a very most important thing that we are doing this as our own tools, or the data is the key to open all doors in the municipality level.
Great, thank you. And a couple of questions, some very good questions coming in on the value of and the importance of a global network, and how you can do it in one community and two communities, and now I understand SDI has done this in 100 communities, and what is it, 1,300 settlements in terms of the profiling of settlements. But Sky and Dudeni or Fuseni, could you talk about the importance of having a network and how you build strength between the various parts of this network?
I think I can take a first stab that sort of builds upon some of the examples that Fuseni was giving from Accra. thanks to the Know Your City campaign was actually a joint initiative of UCLGA, United Cities and Local Governments of Africa, and Cities Alliance. And so the three institutions, SDI, UCLGA, and Cities Alliance, Cities Alliance set up what was called a country program for inclusive urban development. And the first country where this was launched was in Uganda. And so the programming was developed by Cities Alliance and its partners. SDI was a core partner in that. And written into the programming for this urban program was that profiling, enumeration, and mapping by communities would anchor the formulation of partnerships, urban core forums, and then this would feed into the development of urban policy at national level and city development strategies. So now the value of having a global network is that the success that the Federation, the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development, and the municipal councils in Uganda had through peer-to-peer exchange within this global network, this was replicated first in Ghana. So what Fuseni is talking about, they did citywide profiling, they established forums, and then this informed the community upgrading fund projects and the rollout of those. This was directly replicated and took a lot of learning from the Uganda process. Now the Ghanaians are actually teaching their neighbors in Liberia who are setting up exactly the same process. So, and through the sort of gains in those three programs, other affiliates within the SDI network and their government partners have come to witness and to take part in learning by doing exchanges, where they are able to understand really concretely how organized communities can feed into the planning and implementation of new urban policies and programs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, great. And just one follow-on question from there that fits very nicely. Can you talk more about the kind of funding and funding institutions that can support increasing the scale? So you've got the network, you've got the learning exchanges. What going forward in terms of scaling and strengthening and expanding and deepening this? What are the kinds of funding institutions that can help do that?
So part of the Know Your City campaign that SDI and UCLGA committed to, the sort of ultimate goal was that this data feeds into a strategy, and then this strategy, the implementation, is funded by a community upgrading fund. SDI has urban poor funds in many of its affiliate countries, and then within these Know Your City campaigns, community upgrading funds at the municipal or city level have also been established. These serve as basket funds because the community savings groups that both Ndodeni and Fuseni have been talking about, they make a contribution that leverages then the resources of the state and also other partners to implement the programs that were jointly formulated, the interventions that were jointly identified by the city and the communities. So these urban poor funds, community upgrading funds have been and continue to serve as a key instrument for scaling up this work and the implementation of the recommendations that come out of these partnerships.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the exploration, I mean, Katrina's description of the exploration of how private sector investments, one thing is to influence and try and get public institutions, public sector and governments on board to the possible extent, the greatest extent possible. And I guess the other is trying to see what you can do with private capital. And I was amazed when SDI told me about the amount of savings groups, the depth of savings groups, the discipline that's involved, and then the looking at how to lever those savings. Definitely a core part of this.
And I think with this, sorry Nancy, could I just say that with this innovation grant, that's exactly the direction that we're trying to pursue, because to date, we haven't fully understood how to engage the private sector, and we're learning to talk each other's language. So in the partnership with GIB, we're trying to really understand each other. We're trying to figure out what is the information that the communities are producing and how can they begin a dialogue with global private sector institutions and their local private sector institutions. And we're hoping this innovation grant enables us to do that more strategically. Great.
Let me raise panelists, if you're looking at the questions, we're going to use this last part of the webinar to pick up the questions that haven't been addressed. So find one that you'd like to speak to, but I have to read this out. This is someone writing from the Philippines. This is Ermi Rivera from the Philippines, founding president of What a Gorgeous Youth Advocacy, Inc. Fabulous. Startup advocacy aiming to collaborate to achieve a resilient community with the help of youth and young professionals and empower them to cultivate their innermost talents. Let's talk about the role of youth. I mean, this is Africa. Youth is this is the future. We're not the future anymore, sadly, but youth and what you're doing with SDI, and I don't know what 100 Resilient City is doing on the youth side. So talk a bit about that, if you can.
Okay, maybe Dodeni can talk about how they engage with youth in Durban.
Yeah, in Durban, we have some things that we're doing in youth to try them to open the saving schemes and join the mamas, because the women are mostly people, so they can teach youth how they can do things. So the youth in our area, when they finish matrics, they don't know how to go to college and how to fill the forms of university and all those stuffs. So we have some sort of groups that we are making so that the youth can teach each other how to do all the things that is for the youth. And they are doing lots of things like plays, like to do dramas, so that they can keep themselves busy, not to stick on the drugs and all these things.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a very good question here also. You know, we know that this is all hard, and we know that development half the time doesn't really work as we want it to. We've got a question around what are some of the problems that you've experienced in setting and implementing the Know Your City data collection. What are the problems in doing this, and how have you overcome them?
Yes, I can come on that. The big problem in our informal settlements is the politics. But because of our strategy, we are using the exchanges so that we can influence the government policies. On that exchanges, the people that we're taking to the exchanges, they coming back to their informal settlement and being learned from the other cities or from the other informal settlement, that the people, they can do things for themselves. So what we're doing, we just take the one settlement to the other settlements to see how they can do savings and how they can see how that settlements did the things for themselves. So the exchanges, I think, is the very most tool that we use to influence the government policy, because lots of our politics, when you're going there, they are interfering in our processes. But because of the ruling people in that settlement, they are very suffer. We are taking them to the nearby settlement. Then when they're coming back, they can influence those politicians that we need this ourselves, not yours.
Thank you. It's amazing how politics and influencing politics is just a universal feature of life, you know, and right from the ground up, it's a challenge. And Sage, you want to talk about that? 100 Resilient Cities is situated, has chosen to be situated in a very political space in cities, in the mayor's office, and you know that's the whole promise of 100 Resilient Cities, is you influence those in power. What's been hard about that, and what's working?
Yeah, so in a number of our cities, so the CROs in the Resilience Office is situated in different parts of city government, depending on kind of what we've been able to negotiate with the city and the city's priorities. In focusing on Accra and Cape Town, as we are right now, the Resilience Office is very closely situated to the mayor's office. And so that can present a significant opportunity, right? So in Accra, the Chief Resilience Officer is, he's a very close political ally of the mayor. And so when the new mayor came into office in the first quarter of last year, he actually came on with him, and that certainly allowed him to have an audience with the mayor and to sort of push these as political priorities, whether it's, you know, push the emerging initiatives coming out of the strategy, those that are being co-defined by the SDI federations locally, and those also that are, you know, unrelated to that. He's able to have an audience that's a bit different than if that was not the reality. So we definitely think that the politics of it all matters, and we work to ensure that the resilience strategy, even though it can be and it should be agnostic of administration. So, you know, the fact that there's a new administration shouldn't mean that the strategy cannot be pursued towards implementation. But we do work to ensure that you know, we're coaching the CROs to strive for that political alignment, because it will advance what's possible.
Yeah. And Katerina, how do you are often talking with investors and private sector people who are probably, you know, live in a different world than many of the whole development world works in. How do you find influencing they're very powerful, they're very influential. What's the kind of dialogue you have there to try and get them to realize the potential of this?
Coming back to the language, what we have been trying at DIB is to find a common language between investors, sustainability, different actors and stakeholders. And I think to investors, really, the whole de-risking part translates very well. So I think this is something we can work with in finding out where, in which context, which kind of risk can be mitigated to create a better investment environment. I think this is something we could look into, but as we said, it's an innovation. We're still really trying to understand each other and each other's data, and we're trying to find a way to connect these indicators. And the other question really is, I think there are two aspects to infrastructure and informal settlements. The one aspect we can help with is really the definition or the prioritization of basic infrastructure needs and that process. But with big infrastructure projects, like major infrastructure projects, there's also another question. It's really how we can make sure that local stakeholders are really engaged in the development of those infrastructure projects, because they're affected most directly. So I think these are two things we have to think about, and we're still trying to figure that out together.
Yeah, and I think it was in conversation with you, or maybe maybe Ense, I can't remember now. But cities So if think about the de-risking, and then think about the money that cities get, either through, well, in the US, it's through municipal bonds and, you know, the credit ratings, and cities have to have a good credit rating to raise money. So how do we think about influencing the way credit ratings happen? You know, what matters here? What matters here in terms of resilience? What matters in terms of involving all the population? And it was only for me working, doing some work with SDI, did I realize that over 50% of the population of some cities in Africa live in informal settlements. So this is, you know, this is not a trivial number when cities raise finance for the kind of things that they do. So that's part of the potential and the promise, I think, of this new space of looking at how you influence that. And say, do you want to talk maybe a little bit on the, is the Norfolk example a good example of influencing finance? Or do you have another one since then?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of thinking about how we influence finance, actually even just sticking to sort of the African context for the cities that we're focusing on, a big part of like the conversation around informality is also a conversation around finance, right? And so this can be one of those spaces of tension, right? So someone asks a question of like how receptive are city governments to this data, and one space of tension, but we're trying to figure out how to like best navigate is these oftentimes assumptions around how informality affects a city's tax base, right? So we talk about finance and there's external finance, but there's also, you know, how cities are generating their own internal finances, right? And there's quite a bit, and you know, one of the potentials really, I think, of this Know Your City data too, is how it can help cities think about the economic realities, right? The economic potentials of better integration of the informal sector with the formal sector. And so that doesn't mean like squashing the informal sector, but figuring out where those interlinkages really exist and figuring out how that can strengthen a city's economic base, whether it's into city coffers or city's economic base as it relates to economic prosperity for citizens. So in Cape Town, for example, one of the things that they've been talking about and thinking about as they think about how to integrate this Know Your City data is identifying industries within the informal sector, and they're hoping that this is a promise of the KYC data, identifying particular industries where there's actually room for more people to be employed, right? Where, because those are sectors where informal workers are able to generate significant incomes or incomes that are sort of better than in other sectors within the informal sector, and then thinking about what the city of Cape Town can do to support the development of those sectors, right? And so that obviously is something that then strengthens economic opportunity for citizens who are working within that sector, right? And so one of their keenest interests within the Know Your City data is to understand within these informal settlements, like where are the industries that are even forming within these informal settlements? Where are people who are living within informal settlements, if they're employed informally? What sectors are they, or what industries are they employed in, right? So I think one thing that's been really exciting is to see the ways in which the cities are thinking creatively about how this data could actually strengthen economic opportunity for residents within their city, and in that way, right, strengthen city finances. So it's a bit of a circuitous way, but I hope that example landed for folks.
Yeah, no, it's a good one. Okay, in the last few minutes that we have, and this is great. We're all, you know, still online, which is nothing short of a miracle for those of you that do these things regularly. The last words to our Federation members here, and Dodeni or Fuseni, if you had to say one thing to the participants on here and the world at large that you would want them to pay attention to of the power of what you're doing, what would it be?
Yeah, looking at the resilience issues within Accra, the informal settlement dwellers, together with their economic activities, form a majority of the city within Accra. So we are bringing everybody on board in order for them to also to contribute into the decision that the strategies that the city are planning. So that is why our last meeting with the AMA, we bring a lot of informal dwellers. The informal dwellers, the market queens, the kaya, the scrap dealers, the border taxi, and then urban farmers. We bring everybody on board for also to share their issues and the challenges that they face in their particular areas, for the city to also make the impact in terms of how they are going to include all these issues into the planning of the assemble.
That's great.
So
Thank you. Thank you. I think the power of thinking about the economic value, and one of the panelists earlier said, what's the business model for this? What's the business model for this to really be in the game in a serious, powerful way? And Dodeni, if you had 1 minute to say what's most important to pay attention to, what would it be?
Oh, thank you. I think as we are here in South Africa and in Durban, we are working with GIB to do the profiling of the 23 settlements. So we are in a position to do it now. I think the lot of settlements they need that profiling system, and the municipality to be the part of that profiling system, because we are needing more people to be involved in this Know Your City campaign strategy.
Perfect. Okay, and in the last minute, just to thank everyone, thank you all. There were other great questions, much to do with, some to do with tools and measurement, and I will rely on the Zilient team, the brilliant Zilient team, to get you the contacts that we can have more exchanges about what those tools are and what the measures look like. Thank you all, and there'll be a second round on this once the open innovation work is over to actually see the results of what's happened. So thank you and goodbye.